The beginning of any true spiritual awakening is not a moment of light and bliss, but of disorientation, confusion, and dissolution. It feels as though something inside you is dying, and in a sense, it is the death of the false self. This false self is the ego, the image you have built over the years to fit into society's expectations, to gain love, to achieve success, and to avoid rejection. It is the persona that hides your deeper truth. When awakening begins, the structures that once gave your life meaning start to collapse. The ambitions that once motivated you lose their flavor, the roles you play no longer feel real, and the identity you've built starts to feel like a costume that no longer fits. This is not a failure of the self, but the beginning of its unveiling. The ego, for most of life, serves a functional purpose. It organizes the psyche, helps you navigate the external world, and provides a sense of continuity. Yet it also deceives. It convinces you that it is who you are. When spiritual awakening begins, consciousness starts to expand beyond this limited identity, and the illusion of control begins to crumble. You begin to sense that there is something vast, impersonal, and eternal behind the small I that you have been serving. But before this truth can be embraced, the old self must die. This death is not physical but psychological, a dismantling of attachments and false securities. The person who emerges from this process is not new, rather, they are closer to what they have always been beneath the surface. The process of ego death often feels like chaos. You may feel detached from your previous life, alienated from people you once felt close to, and uncertain of what anything means. The world appears hollow, and even your emotions lose their familiar tone. This emptiness is the void between identities. The ego, sensing its end, resists fiercely. It clings to habits, possessions, and people in an attempt to reassert itself. It may even disguise its fear as spirituality, claiming enlightenment while subtly seeking validation. But awakening cannot be achieved through resistance. It demands surrender, the willingness to let go of who you think you are to discover who you truly are. This surrender is the most difficult step because the ego interprets it as annihilation. Yet from a deeper perspective, it is liberation. When you stop identifying with the false self, you realize that you are not the roles you play, but the awareness that observes them. You are not the thinker, but the witness of thought. The false self is constructed through memory and repetition, but the true self exists outside of time. This realization cannot be reached intellectually. It emerges through the direct experience of loss, silence, and stillness. When everything external loses meaning, you are forced to look inward. In that depth, a new center begins to form, not the ego's center, but the center of being. The death of the false self is not an event that happens once and for all. It unfolds gradually in cycles of revelation and resistance. Each time you believe you have found your true self, another layer of illusion falls away. The ego subtly rebuilds itself, seeking new ways to feel special, superior, or secure. Therefore, awakening requires constant vigilance and humility. It asks that you question even your spiritual experiences and see how the ego may be using them for self-importance. Only by remaining inwardly honest can the process continue toward genuine transformation. This death is not destruction but purification, the burning away of everything that is not real. When the false self dissolves, life itself begins to reorganize around a new axis. Instead of chasing meaning in external validation, you begin to feel guided from within. Your choices arise from a quiet inner knowing rather than fear or desire. Relationships become less about need and more about mutual growth. Success loses its superficial appeal and simplicity becomes sacred. You no longer strive to be someone because you recognize that the essence of your being is already complete. In this state, there is no need to prove, defend, or compare. The external world continues as before, but your relationship to it changes completely. You see through the illusions of competition and status and perceive the deep interconnectedness of all existence. To the outside world, the one who has experienced the death of the false self may appear detached, strange, or even lost. But inwardly, they have found a peace that cannot be explained. They have ceased to live from the surface and begun to live from the depths. This transformation is not an escape from humanity, but its fulfillment. By letting the false self die, you allow life itself to live through you more authentically. You become a vessel for something greater than personality, a quiet radiance that acts without self-interest. This is the essence of true awakening, not the creation of a superior self, but the revelation of the timeless self that has always been present, waiting behind the mask to be remembered. When a person begins to awaken spiritually, the light of consciousness expands beyond the boundaries of the known self. Yet with every increase in light, the shadows grow more visible. The shadow represents all that the conscious ego rejects, denies, or represses. The primitive instincts, hidden fears, secret desires, and unresolved wounds buried deep within the psyche. For most of life, these forces remain concealed beneath the surface, shaping behavior from the unconscious. But when awakening begins, they rise in rebellion, demanding recognition. This is the moment of confrontation with the shadow, and it is one of the most challenging and essential stages of spiritual growth. Many people mistake awakening for immediate bliss and enlightenment. They believe the expansion of consciousness will dissolve suffering and fear. But the truth is more complex. The first impact of light is not peace but exposure. The psyche begins to reveal everything that was hidden in darkness. The mind is forced to face the pain it has long suppressed: resentment, guilt, jealousy, shame, and unhealed trauma. These forces, once buried, now emerge with intensity, sometimes even with violence. They distort perception, creating inner conflict and confusion. One begins to realize that enlightenment is not the denial of darkness, but its integration. The light does not destroy the shadow, it illuminates it. The shadow's rebellion is not an act of evil but of necessity. It is the psyche's way of restoring balance. The ego, in its need for control, constructs an image of goodness, righteousness, or strength, and anything that contradicts that image is pushed into the unconscious. But the more we repress, the stronger those denied aspects become. They gather energy and wait for the moment to express themselves. During awakening, as the walls of the ego weaken, the shadow finds an opening to emerge. The feelings, impulses, and memories we thought we had conquered begin to reappear. This confrontation can feel like regression, but in truth it is progress. The psyche is cleansing itself of its own deception. To face the shadow is to face oneself without illusion. It requires the courage to look at what you fear most, to admit that cruelty, envy, lust, or weakness live within you as much as they live within others. This does not mean indulging them, but understanding their roots. Every shadow aspect carries energy that can be transformed. Aggression can become assertiveness, envy can become admiration, fear can become caution, and desire can become creativity. The goal is not to eliminate the shadow, but to make it conscious, to allow its energy to serve the whole personality rather than sabotage it from below. This integration is what Jung called the process of individuation, the uniting of opposites within the self. However, the modern world makes shadow work especially difficult. Society encourages denial, projecting collective darkness onto others through politics, religion, and social conflict. People find it easier to condemn the faults of others than to recognize those same tendencies within themselves. Yet the spiritually awakened individual must reverse this pattern. They must turn inward and see that what they hate in others mirrors what they have not yet accepted in themselves. This realization dissolves judgment and breeds compassion. When you see that your own heart contains both sinner and saint, you stop dividing the world into good and evil and begin to understand the deeper unity of all opposites. The rebellion of the shadow also tests spiritual authenticity. It reveals whether awakening is genuine or superficial. If you cling to the image of being good, pure, or enlightened, the shadow will continue to sabotage you from the unconscious. But if you face it openly, without judgment, it loses its destructive power. The integration of darkness does not make you less spiritual, it makes you real. It grounds the light in human experience. True transformation is not achieved by ascending away from the shadow, but by descending into it and bringing light there. Only then can consciousness become whole. This process is neither quick nor comfortable. It demands humility, patience, and self-honesty. The ego resists, for it fears losing control. Yet each time you confront and integrate a part of your shadow, you reclaim lost vitality. You feel more alive, more creative, more compassionate. The energy once trapped in repression becomes available for growth. You begin to see that even your flaws serve a purpose. They reveal where consciousness is still needed. In this sense, the shadow is not your enemy, but your greatest teacher. It guides you toward authenticity by showing you everything that stands in its way. The rebellion of the shadow, therefore, is a sacred confrontation. It is the psyche's cry for wholeness, the soul's demand to be seen in its entirety. To deny the shadow is to remain divided, to embrace it is to become real. The awakening individual learns that enlightenment is not a flight from darkness, but the illumination of it. The shadow, once feared and despised, becomes the gateway to inner freedom. Through this encounter, the chosen one learns that light and darkness are not enemies but partners in the evolution of consciousness, each necessary for the other to exist. One of the most subtle and dangerous traps on the path of awakening is the temptation of spiritual pride. When the veil of illusion begins to lift and a person starts to perceive deeper truths about existence, a sense of expansion naturally arises. The ego, however, does not simply disappear in the presence of light, it adapts. It puts on a new disguise, the mask of enlightenment. It begins to whisper that you are special, more evolved, or chosen above others. This is the shadow of awakening, and it is far more insidious than ordinary arrogance, for it hides behind the language of spirituality and self-realization. Spiritual pride is the ego's final stand, the last defense it builds before surrendering to the self. At the beginning of spiritual awakening, a person often feels liberated from many of the illusions that govern ordinary life. They see through the vanity of success, the falseness of social approval, and the emptiness of materialism. In this clarity, a powerful energy of freedom is felt, and for a moment, the ego seems to dissolve. But soon it reemerges, now strengthened by a new identity, the identity of the awakened one. It begins to compare again, but this time in more refined ways. Instead of measuring itself by wealth or appearance, it measures by awareness, the wisdom or spiritual purity. The ego says, I am more conscious than they are, and in that very moment, the awakening loses its purity. The seeker becomes trapped in a subtler illusion, mistaking the idea of enlightenment for its reality. The danger of spiritual pride lies in its invisibility. It feels righteous rather than selfish, enlightened rather than egotistical. It convinces the individual that they have transcended ego, while in truth, the ego has merely changed its form. This is why many spiritual teachers and mystics have warned against proclaiming oneself awakened or enlightened. The very claim proves its falsity. True realization is humble and silent, because it recognizes that the self that could claim ownership has dissolved. When pride appears on the path, it is a sign that awakening has paused at the level of intellect rather than penetrating the depths of being. The light of understanding has illuminated the mind, but the heart has not yet surrendered. To overcome this temptation, the one must practice constant self-observation. Every sense of superiority, every desire to be admired for insight, they must be seen for what it is, the ego seeking to survive under a new form. Spiritual pride often expresses itself through subtle judgments. You may begin to see others as asleep, ignorant, or lost in illusion. But in truth, such thoughts reveal the lingering separation between you and the whole. The awakened state is not one of comparison but of unity. It sees divinity in all beings, even in those still trapped in their illusions. To truly awaken is to see yourself in others and others in yourself. The moment you believe you stand above anyone, you have fallen back into ego. The antidote to spiritual pride is humility, not the kind that belittles oneself, but the humility that recognizes the infinite vastness of truth. Awakening is not a personal achievement, it is grace. You do not awaken by your own power, but by surrendering to the greater intelligence that moves through you. The more you awaken, the more you see how little you know. Each layer of realization reveals another mystery beyond comprehension. The awakened soul walks gently, because it knows that consciousness is not something to possess, but something to serve. It is the mystery that breathes through every form, not the property of the individual. When this humility takes root, spiritual pride dissolves like mist in sunlight. Another form of spiritual pride appears as the urge to save or teach others prematurely. The ego, excited by its newfound awareness, seeks validation through guiding others, believing it must awaken the world. But authentic teaching does not arise from superiority, it arises from compassion. It does not demand that others follow, but invites them to discover truth within themselves. The truly awakened person knows that every soul awakens in its own time and in its own way. They do not force light upon others, but embody it quietly, allowing presence to speak louder than words. When the inner light is genuine, it attracts naturally without the need for persuasion or control. Ultimately, the temptation of spiritual pride tests whether the awakening is genuine or partial. It exposes the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge can make one proud, wisdom makes one humble. Knowledge says, I understand, while wisdom whispers, I am still learning. When you stop needing to be seen as awakened, you finally begin to awaken. When you release the desire to stand above others, you rise into wholeness with them. Spiritual awakening, in its truest form, is not about becoming special. It is about becoming real. It is the return to simplicity, to the awareness that the same divine essence animates all beings equally. Pride divides, humility unites, and only in unity does the soul find peace. The path of individuation is the central journey of spiritual awakening, the process through which a person becomes whole by uniting the conscious and unconscious aspects of their being. It is not a path toward perfection or purity, but toward authenticity. Most people live fragmented lives, identifying with the persona they show the world while suppressing the deeper truths of their psyche. They become strangers to themselves, acting out roles imposed by family, culture, and society. Individuation begins when a person feels the inner tension of this split and dares to turn inward to discover who they truly are beyond all masks. This journey demands courage, patience, and solitude, for it leads not outward toward conformity, but inward toward truth. At the beginning of individuation, the individual feels a kind of inner restlessness. The outer world, once full of meaning, starts to lose its hold. Ambitions, possessions, and relationships that once provided identity begin to feel hollow. This is the call of the self, the deeper, organizing principle of the psyche that seeks wholeness. The self does not destroy the ego, but invites it into transformation. The ego must surrender its illusion of control and accept that it is not the center of existence, but one part of a much greater whole. This surrender often feels like a crisis. The person feels torn between who they have been and who they are becoming. But it is precisely this tension that generates growth. The psyche evolves through the friction between opposites. As one walks the path of individuation, the unconscious begins to communicate through dreams, symbols, and synchronicities. These are not random occurrences, but messages from the deeper layers of the psyche, guiding the individual toward integration. Each symbol carries meaning that transcends rational thought. A snake in a dream, for example, may represent transformation, while a storm may symbolize emotional turbulence or divine upheaval. To interpret these messages is to enter a dialogue with the unconscious. This dialogue requires humility, for the unconscious is older, wiser, and more vast than the conscious mind. It holds the key to healing and balance, but it also confronts the ego with everything it has denied, its shadow, its wounds, and its forgotten potentials. Integration is the heart of individuation. It is not enough to understand the unconscious intellectually. One must embody its truths. This means accepting the contradictions within oneself, the capacity for both love and cruelty, strength and weakness, creation and destruction. By reconciling these opposites, a new center emerges, the self. The self is not merely an idea but a living reality, an inner axis that brings harmony to the personality. When you live from the self, your actions no longer arise from fear or imitation, but from inner necessity. You stop striving to be what others expect and begin to express what life intends through you. This is the birth of individuality, not in the sense of separation, but of alignment with your unique pattern of being. However, the individuation is not an escape from the world. It is a return to it with greater awareness. The individuated person does not reject society, but stands within it with inner freedom. They no longer depend on collective opinion for validation, yet they serve the collective by embodying wholeness. In a world driven by conformity and ego, the individuated person becomes a quiet revolutionary, showing that authenticity itself is an act of liberation. Their presence challenges others to question their own masks and reconnect with the truth within. Thus, individuation is not selfish. It is the path through which the individual contributes to the evolution of collective consciousness. The journey of individuation also demands solitude. The individual must learn to withdraw at times from the noise of the world to listen to the voice within. Solitude is not loneliness, it is communion with the self. In this stillness, the fragments of the psyche begin to align. You begin to sense that life is guided by a deeper intelligence that works through every joy and sorrow, every experience, success and failure, love and loss, serves as material for growth. Individuation does not seek to escape suffering, but to give it meaning. Through this process, the suffering becomes sacred, for it refines the soul and reveals the gold hidden in the depths of the psyche. As the journey continues, the individual experiences a growing sense of unity with existence. The boundaries between inner and outer begin to blur. What happens in the world mirrors the movement of the soul. The individual no longer feels like a separate fragment, but a conscious expression of the whole. Yet, paradoxically, this realization does not erase individuality, it fulfills it. To become one with the self is to become fully yourself and fully part of life at once. This is the mystery of individuation. Through deep inwardness, you rediscover your belonging to the greater totality. The path of individuation never truly ends. It is a lifelong process of becoming, a spiral that deepens with every turn. Each new stage of consciousness brings new challenges and new possibilities. The person who commits to this journey does not seek enlightenment as an escape, but as participation in the unfolding of the self. To individuate is to live consciously, to embrace both light and darkness, and to allow the eternal to manifest through the finite. In doing so, you become what you were always meant to be, a unique expression of the divine order, a bridge between the human and the eternal. The moment an individual begins to awaken to deeper truth, a profound sense of isolation often follows. This solitude is not chosen out of arrogance or misanthropy, but arises naturally as the old bonds that once connected the person to society begin to dissolve. The values, conversations, and desires that once felt meaningful start to lose their power. The awakening individual finds themselves standing apart, not because they wish to, but because their perception of reality has changed. What others call success, they may now see as illusion. What others chase, they may find empty. This separation creates a loneliness that cuts deep, for awakening pulls you away from the comfort of collective belonging into the vast, the uncertain territory of the soul. Isolation in this context is not merely physical, but psychological and spiritual. You begin to realize that few people can truly understand what you are experiencing. The more your consciousness expands, the more difficult it becomes to fit into the patterns of ordinary life. The conversations that once entertained you now feel hollow, and the ambitions that once drove you seem trivial. You may even feel like a stranger among friends or an outsider in your own family. This can be deeply painful, for human beings are social by nature, and to feel disconnected from others feels like exile. Yet this exile is not punishment, it is initiation. Solitude becomes the crucible through which the self is purified and strengthened. In the silence of isolation, the inner world begins to reveal itself. Without the noise of external distractions, you start to hear the quiet voice of the self. The solitude that once felt like emptiness transforms into sacred space. It is in this space that the psyche begins to reorder itself, that the fragments of identity, ego, shadow, and soul begin to communicate. The individual learns to dwell within their own depths, to face the fears that society helps people avoid through endless business. The isolation becomes a mirror reflecting every aspect of the self, forcing confrontation with what has been denied or avoided. This is why solitude can feel unbearable at first. It shows you everything you are not yet willing to see. The world today, driven by ego and constant stimulation, has made true solitude almost impossible. We are taught to fear stillness, to equate being alone with being lonely. Yet for those on the path of awakening, solitude is medicine. It is the womb of transformation. In silence, you begin to discern between the voice of the ego and the voice of the soul. The ego cries out for recognition, attention, and validation. The soul speaks softly of truth, meaning, and love. Only when you step away from the world's noise can you hear this inner dialogue. The chosen ones, those undergoing spiritual awakening, must learn to endure this period of aloneness without seeking premature escape into distraction or dependence. To survive it is to mature spiritually. But the burden of isolation is not without its temptations. In solitude, the one may fall into despair or superiority. Some become bitter, resenting the world for not understanding them. Others feel chosen in a way that feeds the ego, believing they are above ordinary people. Both responses are traps that halt growth. The purpose of solitude is not to separate you from humanity, but to prepare you to return to it with new eyes. It refines compassion by stripping away illusion. When you learn to live peacefully with your own mind, you can meet others with true empathy, for you recognize in them the same struggles you have faced within yourself. Solitude, rightly lived, leads not to isolation from others but to deeper connection. During this phase, patience becomes essential. The isolation can last months or years, depending on the individual's readiness to integrate what they have discovered. One must not rush the process or try to recreate the old self to regain comfort. Every moment of loneliness is an opportunity to strengthen inner stability. Slowly, the silence becomes a friend. You begin to see that you were never truly alone, for the self, the deeper intelligence within, has been guiding you all along. This realization transforms loneliness into communion. You no longer crave company to fill a void, because the void itself has become sacred. You discover that the space between you and the world is not emptiness but presence. Eventually, the isolation gives birth to a new form of relationship with life. You re-enter the world not as someone seeking validation, but as one who gives meaning through presence. The connections you form after awakening are no longer based on need or conformity, but on resonance. You attract those whose souls vibrate with the same truth. The world does not change, but your way of being in it does. You begin to serve quietly, not by preaching, but by embodying authenticity. You realize that solitude was never a curse, it was preparation. The silence taught you how to listen, the loneliness taught you how to love without condition, and the isolation taught you how to stand in truth even when no one stands beside you. The burden of isolation is heavy only for the ego. For the soul, it is freedom. It strips away the false connections that once defined you and replaces them with a deeper bond to existence itself. Through isolation, you learn that belonging does not come from being understood by others, but from understanding yourself. And when you have faced the emptiness within and found it full of life, you are ready to walk among people again, not as one of the asleep, but as one awake, carrying the quiet strength of solitude within your heart. After the long and often painful journey of awakening, the individual reaches a point where isolation, inner conflict, and transformation have fulfilled their purpose. The ego has been tempered, the shadow integrated, and the self discovered as the true center of being. Yet awakening is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of a new responsibility. The awakened person is called to return to the world, not to escape from it or rise above it, but to serve as a bridge between the visible and invisible, the material and the spiritual, the human and the divine. This return marks the completion of the cycle of awakening, where inner realization finds expression in outer life. For many, the temptation after awakening is to remain in solitude, to live apart from society's illusions. The world, with its chaos, egoism, and distraction, feels unbearable compared to the stillness of the inner life. Yet if one remains in withdrawal, the awakening remains incomplete. The purpose of enlightenment is not to hide from the world, but to bring light into it. The awakened individual must carry the wisdom gained in the depths of consciousness back into the realm of human relationships, work, and community. They become a living example of what it means to be whole in a fractured world. In this way, they act as a bridge, connecting the higher and lower, spirit and matter, heaven and earth. To return as a bridge means to live in two realities at once. On one hand, you remain aware of the eternal, the unseen order that underlies all existence. On the other, you engage with the ordinary world of time, struggle, and imperfection. This dual awareness is not easy to maintain. It requires balance, humility, and constant remembrance of the self. The awakened individual must learn to move between these realms without losing equilibrium, rooted in the inner truth while still responding to the outer demands of life. This is a sacred art, for to live in both worlds is to embody the union of opposites that awakening has revealed within. You become the meeting point of divine consciousness and human limitation. The bridge also serves as a channel for transformation. When a person lives authentically from the self, their very presence influences others. They need not preach or persuade. Their calmness, compassion, and integrity radiate silently. Those who encounter them may feel a sense of peace without knowing why. This is the power of embodied consciousness. It communicates truth beyond words. The awakened person's task is not to convert others, but to awaken what already sleeps within them. By living as an example of integration, they remind others that such harmony is possible. Every act, no matter how small, becomes a reflection of the greater order. In this way, the bridge connects not only realms of being, but hearts and minds across humanity. However, to serve as a bridge is also to carry a burden. The awakened one feels the suffering of the world more deeply than before. Compassion replaces indifference, but this compassion can be painful. The individual sees how ignorance, greed, and fear govern much of human behavior, and it can be tempting to despair. Yet the mature soul understands that darkness and light are part of the same process of evolution. The world's imperfection is not a flaw, but a field in which consciousness continues to unfold. To live as a bridge is to accept this tension, to love humanity even in its blindness, and to trust that every soul is moving, however slowly, toward its own awakening. This acceptance turns compassion into strength rather than sorrow. Returning to the world also requires discernment. The awakened individual must learn to express their inner truth in forms that the collective mind can receive. Not all insights can be spoken, some must be lived. The bridge does not impose, it translates. It finds ways to communicate the ineffable through art, work, kindness, or silent presence. In this sense, the awakened person becomes both creator and healer. Their task is to weave spirit into the patterns of daily life, transforming ordinary moments into expressions of the sacred. Through them, the divine re-enters the world, not as doctrine, but as living experience. Ultimately, returning as a bridge between worlds means accepting the paradox of being human and divine at once. You know yourself as consciousness, vast and timeless, yet you still inhabit a body, feel emotions, and face limitations. Instead of rejecting this duality, you embrace it as the natural state of existence. You recognize that enlightenment does not erase humanity. It redeems it. Every act of kindness, every word of truth, every moment of awareness becomes part of the bridge that unites heaven and earth. You no longer seek to escape life, but to participate in it fully, as an instrument of consciousness. The journey of awakening thus comes full circle. You began as a seeker, lost in illusion. You descended into the depths of shadow and emerged into the light of the self. Now you return to the world not as the same person, but as a vessel of awareness. The bridge you build through your life allows the divine to touch the human, and the human to rise toward the divine. In this sacred exchange, the world itself is transformed, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet presence of one who has become whole. The chosen ones who walk this path do not belong to either realm alone. They belong to both, standing forever at the threshold, where the eternal meets the temporal, and where love becomes the language that unites them.